before, for those of you who weren't here, it's our great honor and privilege to have Reverend Seth Fisher here today from the Unitarian Universalist Church in Baptisttown. You know, if I ever wondered if I had a speech impediment before, it's become out there and just put it out there every week. So we all welcome Reverend Seth Fisher.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Seth from First Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hunterdon County. And we lose a lot of people to the Unity Church because you can say it in one breath. I'm the minister there because I can say the whole thing. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning for a few reasons. You're so welcoming and warm. But another thing is I've had the experience of people will ask me what I do for a living, and I say I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. And they say, I've been to a Unity church. And my guess is you've probably had something similar.
Yep.
Where you say, I go to a Unity church, and my sister's a Unitarian, or something like that. So one of the reasons it's such a pleasure to talk to you this morning is because I don't have to explain any of that. That they're actually different things. So what is Unitarian Universalism? What is a Unitarian Universalist? And that's one of the things I want to talk to you about this morning. The short, sort of easy version, the simple, easy answer is Unitarian Universalists are the denomination that was created when the Unitarians and the Universalists merged. It's very simple. So I don't know what to do with the rest of our time. It's been nice. Like most short, simple answers, it's not very satisfying. There's more to it than that, right? So the obvious question is, who are the Unitarians and who are the Universalists? And here's where it gets a little more interesting. Because Unitarianism and Universalism were both denominations before that merger happened, but they're also both heresies. They're both Christian heresies, things that you could be charged with and convicted of, being a Unitarian or being a Universalist. And, a few hundred years ago, someone could be charged with being a Unitarian and be convicted and killed for it. And so these are theological ideas that have been considered heresies in parts of Christianity throughout history. So Unitarianism specifically is Unitarianism as opposed to Trinitarianism, the three-part God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Unitarianism, very briefly, is the idea that there is just one God, which isn't that revolutionary, right? I mean, Judaism, one God, all about one God. Islam, obviously, they've got one and only one God. And Christianity comes out of Judaism. But when Christianity got to a point where the doctrine of the Trinity then became the official doctrine, challenging that in any way, the idea that God comes in three separate persons, was a heresy. And so there were people, though, that still hung on to this idea, even though they weren't supposed to, and would talk about it. And Unitarianism then became something that was a theological crime. And so one of my favorite theological criminals throughout history is Michael Servetus. Have you guys heard of Michael Servetus?
No.
Oh boy, I really wish I could tell you the whole story of his life because it is amazing. Have you seen? You guys might know Little Big Man, the Dustin Hoffman movie.
Yes.
Right. And Forrest Gump, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, Tom Hanks. Movies about people who were sort of these characters were kind of at the center point of history at that moment. Both of them. Michael Servetus was like that in real life. He was a person who existed right about the time of the invention of the printing press and Protestantism and this sort of discoveries in medicine, and he was right in the middle of all of that. Michael Servetus, I'll kind of give you the short version of his life and just go through it quickly. He was born in Spain. He was a Spanish, Catholic, and a genius in the early 1500s. Very quickly had this ability to learn all kinds of different languages. And early on would study the different texts and learned to read the Bible and sacred scriptures in their original languages, which is why he was coming up with all these theological ideas on his own, rather than just sort of accepting what was given to him. He went to serve the Catholic Church. He was 14 or 15, and he went as sort of an attendant to the coronation of Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. And he was really just taken aback by the opulence and the extravagance of the Catholic Church and the reign of the folks in charge at the time, and thought this isn't really what it's about. And luckily, there was this new thing called Protestantism that had just sort of come up, and it was sort of counter to the Catholic Church. So he went off to go hang out with the Protestants and see what they had to say for a while. And he ended up publishing some works questioning the Trinity as it was presented. He went through the original works. He didn't find any mention of the Trinity there. Sort of found it as an interpretation, and he published these books. And they were interesting. They were different, and they were circulated sort of carefully and quietly among a lot of different folks. And they got back to some of the local church leaders, and so he was invited by the local church leaders to come and discuss his idea with them. In other words, he was summoned before the Spanish Inquisition. Right? And the local story then is that he just spent the rest of his life in a dungeon somewhere and was never heard again, or heard from again. But that's not true. He escaped. He got away. An interesting part of the story is it was his brother, who was a Catholic priest, who was given the job of coming and getting Michael and bringing him to the Inquisition. So, did his brother tip him off? Did his brother, not deliver the message? Or did his brother actually say, yes, I'm bringing my brother in to the Inquisition? We'll never know. It's one of those sort of mysterious things. But he got away. He took off. He changed his name to Michel de Villeneuve, which is just sort of a Frenchified version of his original name anyway. And he goes to school in Paris. And while he's at school, he meets this guy named John Calvin, right? John Calvin, one of the major Protestant reformers at the time. At the time, they're just sort of school chums and sort of frenemies, really. They're both questioning the Catholic Church doctrine, but they're also not on the same page with each other about a lot of the things. Calvin has been persecuted and has had to flee, but agrees to come back and have this debate with Servetus, right? And so makes his way back to Paris, really kind of risking his life, probably. And Servetus doesn't show up for this thing. Now, we don't know if it's because Servetus figured out that it was dangerous for him and Calvin to be in the same place at the same time, that they could be scooped up by the Inquisition there. We know he overslept. We have no idea, right? But one way or another, Calvin's pretty incensed by this. Because he's taken great risks to come back for this debate, and Servetus doesn't show up. But Servetus goes on to teach and write a bunch. He taught medicine, geography, astrology, and astrology was the one that got him in trouble there. So the Inquisition then finds out about this guy. He's teaching astrology. They bring him in. This time they get him in to the Inquisition. And he's in trouble for teaching astrology. And but he gets away again. He gets away again because they don't know he's Michael Servetus, who wrote these books challenging the doctrine of the Trinity. They think he's this Michel de Villeneuve that's teaching astrology and other things. And they say, well, don't teach astrology anymore. He says, okay. And he leaves. And that's it. He gets away. And so he's escaped again, and he takes off. He moves to Lyons, practices medicine for about 12 years. He's a doctor. He writes amazing things. One of them is he's the first person to create a written account, an accurate written account of the circulatory system in the body, how the blood flows through the lung and the heart. The lungs and the heart. They didn't have this figured out at the time. And he writes that as sort of an aside in a theological work, talking about the pneuma and the spirit, and how it's revived through the Spirit of God. So fascinating stuff. He goes on to write, and he's there working directly under the Archbishop for 12 years, right under their nose, without them taking him in. He writes a bunch, and then he writes this book called Christianismi Restitutio, or The Restoration of Christianity. And this is his opus. It lays out all of his theology, and it sort of makes his case for what he wants to do, sort of a reclaiming of a more original version of Christianity. Well, this book begins to circulate, and it gets a little bit of attention. And one of the things in the book is that it's full of these letters between the author and John Calvin. Because Servetus has had this correspondence for years with Calvin. So Calvin, who hates Servetus, gets a copy of this book, sees his own letters in it, and says, this guy that wrote this Restoration of Christianity book, this is Michael Servetus. This is the heretic that you guys are looking for. So Calvin, the Protestant, turns Servetus in to the Catholics. And this time, the Catholics get a hold of him. He does appear before the Inquisition. They know who they've got. They know what he wrote. He is tried and he is convicted, and he is sentenced to death. But he escaped! Right? How is this not a movie? He escaped, and so sometime during the trial, he gets out of the jail where he is. A bunch of money went missing from his account around the same time. So, did he know he was going to escape and he got that money out somehow? Or was it a payoff? Or did he just escape with whatever he had on his back and somebody thought, well, he's not going to be needing this money anymore, and took it? We don't know exactly how it happened, but one way or another, he escapes then across the rooftops of this town where he's being tried and convicted and condemned to death, but he's gone. So they burn him in effigy. They have like a stuffed version of him that they burn up. And he decides to make a run for Italy at this point. He's done with Spain and France. He's going to Italy. And along the way, he stops in Geneva. John Calvin's Geneva. And he's there on a Sunday. So what's he do? He goes to church. John Calvin's church. On Sunday morning, right? And so he's recognized there. And here's the biggest mystery of all. Something I've thought about a lot. Does he not know that it was Calvin that turned him in to the Catholic Inquisition? Does he think he's finally going to get to debate his old buddy from school? Or does he know that he's there and think, well, it's Sunday morning and I'm in church and this is a sanctuary, and they wouldn't, turn me over to be condemned to death here? Or was there something else involved? With Sunday in Geneva, being out and about and not going to church was something you could be arrested for as well. So maybe it was more conspicuous of him not being in church, and he decided to go and hoping he wasn't recognized. We don't know. We don't know why, but he went. He was recognized. This time, finally, it's the Protestants under Calvin who try him and convict him, and they did sentence him to death, and they burned him alive with what was supposed to be the last copy of his book, actually tied to him. They burned his book and him at the pyre. And what's really fascinating about this is that it did not silence him. It wasn't the last copy of that book. A couple of those managed to get out. One of them, really strangely enough, there are very, very few copies of this book. One of them seemed that it got into circulation and has managed to survive the centuries. Seems to have been John Calvin's copy. So it wasn't unusual when you try a heretic and whatever, and you have this material. It was essentially evidence, and it went on Calvin's bookshelf, and so it was not destroyed. And to survive, it was Calvin himself who saved Servetus' book and has been passed down. But it's more than Servetus' book that made his impact on Christianity and government and the world, because people began to look then at the church under this new Protestantism, which was supposed to be a reform of Catholicism, which had kind of gone off the tracks at the time, Protestantism kind of forced Catholicism to get its act together in some ways. And some people were looking at Protestantism and saying, well, if you're burning people alive like this, what's going on? And it made people start asking questions. And there are historians who will look at the establishment of free democracies in the West and the idea of the separation of church and state, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and take that period and trace it really back to Servetus and saying he was the instigator of a lot of this and where this came from. Sebastian Castellio was a theologian, a French theologian, who just after the time after Servetus was killed, he said, to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, it is to kill a man. If Calvin had killed Servetus for saying what he believed to be true, then Calvin killed him for telling the truth. He should have been taught, not killed, if he was wrong. And I believe that on Judgment Day, God will judge morals, not dogmas. So this is Servetus's legacy, the idea that people should have the ability to question doctrine and to think for themselves, and that it's their relationship with the divine, with Christ, that brings salvation, not their relationship with the church, necessarily. The church should be a vehicle for that. And so we see this throughout a lot of liberal Christianity, and even the more conservative forms of it, and even Catholicism. I did my Master of Divinity degree at a Catholic school at Loyola University Chicago, a Jesuit school. And not only did they give me a lot of scholarships, they were very generous, they never once threatened to burn me alive. The whole time I was there. They really mellowed out a lot. Yeah. But seriously though, it's people like this who give up their lives for this idea of religious tolerance. And Servetus is one of them. So that's one of the important paragons in our Unitarian Universalist history, specifically on the Unitarian side, and it's something that you guys can sort of draw from too and look back at as a religious predecessor. And then on the other side is John Murray. Any of you guys know anything about John Murray? John Murray's more of a local story. So you guys, maybe you just have all kinds of miracles like crazy. We got one. We've got one miracle, and it's the story of John Murray and how Universalism came to the United States. So Universalism, as I mentioned, another heresy. Universalism is the idea that everyone will be reconciled with God at some point or another. This is a theological idea that's also very old, that goes back to the beginning of Christianity, that there were Christians very early on who said, well, if God's Son came and showed us the way to salvation and came for the purpose of bringing salvation to the world, how could it not work? We're going to end up there. And there's a theological problem that theologians and people have been sort of chewing on for centuries, and it's theodicy. It's the idea of if there's a good God, how can bad happen in the world, right? And this question of salvation is kind of tied into that. If God wants everyone to have salvation, and God is all-powerful, then that has to happen at some point. Because otherwise, either God didn't create a world or couldn't create a world where everyone would find salvation, or he doesn't really want everyone to. And so the universalist solution of this is, well, everyone will, one way or another, eventually. Maybe there's an afterlife, maybe there's a point of purification or whatever, but sooner or later everyone's reconciled with God and with the divine. That's the idea of universalism. And it was another one of these heresies that people say, you can't say that. You could be tried for that. So it kind of went underground for most of Christian history, but then in the 1700s in England there was this big revival of it, and there was this preacher named Raleigh, who had, the folks of his own church, they called them the Raleigheites or whatever, but he started preaching universalism. He started preaching the gospel of universal salvation. And John Murray was a minister at the Church of England at the time, and one of the members of his congregation had gone and listened to this Raleigh guy and gotten mixed up in some of this universalism stuff. And so John Murray decides he's going to go talk to Raleigh. and straighten this out. And so he goes to debate Relly about universalism, and John Murray ends up being converted himself to universalism. And the problem then was that he lost his job. He is excommunicated from the Church of England because he's not preaching their doctrine anymore, and his house was burned down, and he had other personal tragedies at the time too. His wife and child died, and at this point he's got nothing left. He lost half of his church, and so what do you do in the 1700s when you got nothing to live for? You move to America. Exactly. He bought a ticket, got on a boat because he thought, what's there to lose, right? I'm going to go to the colonies. And he makes it all the way across the Atlantic, and he's on his way to New York, and just off the coast of New Jersey, he runs into a sandbar and is stopped. The boat is stopped there. And they're just stuck until the winds change and the weather shifts. And so some of the people went aboard, they went ashore for supplies and whatnot, and John Murray was one of them. And he's at a tavern, a restaurant, or whatever, and he meets this guy named Thomas Potter. Thomas Potter is a Universalist. Even though there aren't any Universalist preachers in the United States yet at the time. In fact, there's no United States at the time. It's just the colonies. But Potter is a Universalist. He believes in this sort of universal salvation of mankind through the love of God. And he has built a chapel. Even though there are no Universalist preachers, Potter has built a chapel, a Universalist chapel. It's the first Universalist church in the U.S., in the hope and in faith and praying that God would send a minister, would send a preacher to preach a Universalist salvation message in that church. So he meets John Murray, and he says, "You're the guy," right? And John Murray says, "Nope, I'm not the guy. I'm on my way to New York. And as soon as my ship's off that sandbar, I got to keep going." And John Potter says, "No, I'm pretty sure you're the guy." And John Murray says, "No, I'm not the guy." And so finally Potter convinces him that if his ship is still there on Sunday, that he will preach in the chapel. If the winds don't shift for these days, and on Sunday his ship is still there, he'll preach. John Murray figures this is a pretty safe bet, right? The wind doesn't hold steady that long. And he says, "Yeah, fine, if I'm around on Sunday, wink wink, I'll preach at your church." But sure enough, the wind did not change. It held the ship there. He was there on Sunday, and the first Universalist sermon was preached there in Potter's Chapel.
Where is it? Where was that?
It's near. It was Good Luck, New Jersey. Now they've changed it. There's a retreat center now, the Murray Retreat Center, and the old chapel isn't there anymore, but they've rebuilt it, and it's right off. They changed the name of the town because it was a couple hundred years ago.
What exit?
It's right on the shore. I don't know. I've been in New Jersey about a year, and I told people I was moving here, and they said, "What exit, man?" I have no idea what you're talking about. Where I live, New Jersey to me is all like coyotes and deer and stuff. But I can look it up for you. And because there's still a chapel and a retreat center there. Anyway, so that's the story about how Universalism came to the U.S. with John Murray and the faithfulness of Thomas Potter, who had this "if you build it, they will come" idea. I'm very into movie allusions this morning. So there's this whole joke, this old Universalist joke that there's a Universalist preacher and a Baptist preacher, and they're sort of riding the circuit and preaching different churches, and they share the road for a certain amount of the way, and they get to talking. And the Baptist preacher, who's really kind of unnerved by this whole idea of everybody going to heaven, says to the Universalist preacher, "If I'm a Universalist and I don't fear hell, then what's to prevent me from just clubbing you over the head and robbing you and taking your horse and leaving you?" And the Universalist preacher says, "Well, if you were a Universalist, it would never occur to you." And it's a joke, so they're caricatures, and I know there are plenty of good Baptists out there that don't believe in salvation just for the purpose of fire insurance, right? But the point is that salvation through the divine is not motivated by fear, it's motivated by love. It's acceptance of divine love, not fear of divine retribution. That's the central message of universalism. So, these are the two main stories that I wanted to share with you this morning. And then I'll move forward. I got to bring us into the 20th century then. Middle of the last century, the Unitarians and the Universalists, they met and they liked each other very much. And they decided to make a commitment to one another. And they had a baby called Unitarian Universalism. And that's where we are now. Unitarian Universalists now have a wide range of theological beliefs. We are Christian, and we are also Buddhist and Hindu. Atheists are part of our congregations. Our central point that we sort of coalesce around are 7 principles. So this sounds kind of familiar, right? Not having so much a creed or a statement of faith as principles that we adhere to. And we have these principles, and among them are these ideas of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, encouragement toward spiritual growth in one another, and an interconnected web of existence that all of us are a part of. So, I wanted to share these stories with you this morning, partly to share my faith with you and kind of where I'm coming from, also because I think we have some common theological ancestors and some ideas that we can pull from, but also to help inspire you on your journey by sharing what inspires me. These stories are stories of courage and love and hope. Michael Servetus was an example of commitment, of a person so faithful to deepening their understanding of God and so committed to sharing that understanding with others that persecution would not dissuade him, and death did not silence him. John Murray's example of following his heart. So when he found a version of God that didn't fit into his theological concept, rather than trying to stuff God into his intellectual concept, he opened up and expanded his heart to make room for a bigger version of God. And Thomas Potter, who built that chapel with faith and prayer to make way for that message to enter the minds and hearts of so many other people. So may we continue to share our stories with one another and inspire one another on our own spiritual journeys. Amen. Now we have a time of meditation. Right. So, my personal meditation practice is Zen meditation. So I'll just guide us into a simple, centered mindfulness or Anapana meditation. And once we're in the silence, that silence is yours to do with as you will. So we create the silence together, and the silence belongs to you. You can follow your heart in that meditation. I'll just lead us into it. So I invite you to get centered. For a lot of you, that will mean getting comfortable in your chair, maybe sitting upright, so that your spine is in alignment with your feet flat on the floor. Whatever it takes so that your body is comfortable and not taking your attention. Be alert but relaxed. Alert but relaxed. And I invite you to draw your attention to your breath. And you can specifically focus right on your nostrils. Right on that air entering your body and then leaving your body again. And you're not trying to force it to do anything. You're not looking for deep breaths. You don't have to count them or any of that. Just let it be what it is. And at least at first, when thoughts enter your mind, just let them go. Practice being a mountain. Let the thoughts, like clouds, just pass. Don't try and keep them away, but don't chase them either. They'll come and go, and as you notice your mind leading toward thoughts, you can just bring your attention again back to your breath. And I'll invite you now to go ahead and bring your attention back to the room. And to those around you that we share this time with this morning.